Ooh, very nice.
All right, for folks, for y'all that are just dialing in, we'll give it just about a minute as everyone is flooding in, and we'll get started. All right, folks, so we are on time, so we're gonna get going. As a special treat,
we're in person.
Woo!
Back live.
Tim Conway came over to my house. It's for this one, so that's how serious we're taking it. Tim flew all the way in just to be on a webinar with me. Anyways, all right, so right off the bat, if you are not registered for SANS ICS Summit yet, you are wasting your life. You have to register. And the reason you should register is twofold. One, because it's amazing content, and number two, because it's free online. Like, you should come in person. It's going to be a blast down at Walt Disney World, having lots of fun together, great presentations. I've seen the lineup. It is fantastic, but you have no excuse because it's also free online. So sans.org/ICS-summit will get you going. All right, so with that, let's jump right into it. We'll do a quick introduction for those of us that don't know us. I'm Rob Lee, CEO of Dragos, an industrial cybersecurity firm, but I'm also a SANS senior instructor. That's the hat I'll be wearing for today. And I authored the ICS 515 class, so how to monitor your industrial networks, and the 578 class, which is threat intelligence.
Tim Conway. I am with the SANS Institute over the Industrial Control System curriculum. Also a senior instructor like my partner, and also a co-chair of the ICS Summit like my partner.
Twinsies. All right, so to kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to Tim to talk to us about the evolution of the threats we've seen, specifically focusing on malware. There's lots of activity groups and threat groups and similar. We'll talk about that more at the summit, but the evolution of the malware we've seen. I'll then talk about what PIPEDREAM is, and most importantly, we'll focus on mitigations and so forth. At the summit, I'll be giving a more in-depth presentation on the adversary, the background of the threat landscape, kind of more in-depth on the capability. This presentation is kind of an overview with a focus on mitigation. So with that, Tim Conway, ICS malware progression.
Yes, you're going to have to do some slide advances first.
One more first. There we go. Oh, it's you building in things. Getting fancy. All right.
The fun part of this is normally I get all of Rob's side comments in Slack while I'm trying to do a webcast. Now they're just right here and can't be avoided for all. So a couple of things that we wanted to sort of capture first is just how to kind of think about the malware that we've seen in the last couple of weeks that have come up. As you look across kind of Indestroyer 2 and you look across PIPEDREAM, and everything that has led up to this, we've been dealing with kind of ICS impacting malware that wasn't really targeted towards ICS environments. They were used for access operations. They were used for kind of information gathering and collection. And in some cases, they had nothing to do with ICS, but they made their way into industrial control system environments due to poor architecture, due to kind of allowed communications into the process environment. That kind of ICS general purpose opportunistic stage is what we were used to dealing with for a very, very long time, and it's where our defenses needed to be. As that progressed into more ICS themed delivery techniques and campaigns and specific tailored access with Havex and Black Energy, and you started looking at those ICS specific malware capabilities that you'd find in Havex, that was still kind of part of an information collection, information gathering campaign that could further enable future attacks. You could talk about the defenses for those with normal words like, well, we have NERC-CIP and we have governance, or we have IEC, we have standards, we have regulation. We're going to go do segmentation and architecture, strong cyber hygiene and passive defenses. And if you go to the next, as we start moving more into ICS tailored effects components. And some of the malware that we've seen specifically in 2016 with crash override and specifically with Trisis, those two things you start to look at and say, those are kind of modular or custom built packages for a target with a specific goal that has an effects-based goal that can misuse the environment to drive the process to some level of equipment damage, potentially human loss of life. And we've been struggling kind of with those three. How do we start thinking about defending our environments when we're so focused on reliability? We're so focused on keeping the system up. And now you begin to see this effects-based malware being deployed that can cause the system to be damaged. And if you no longer have the integrity of your system, should your incentive be to keep the system up when someone else is in control of it? And as we've been struggling with those three pieces that are highlighted kind of in that triangle of Stuxnet, crash override, and Trisis for years, now within a week, we start seeing more introducing rapidly from a couple of activity groups that you can anticipate there's going to be many variations that are going to continue to accelerate quickly. Next. Again, looking at the speed of what we're dealing with, going back from 2008 all the way forward, whether you're talking about specific malware or some campaigns, there's still not a lot on this slide to look at. Arrow your way through some of these, from process data collection to remote access toolkits, operator data collection as you're moving more into the process environment. And in 2016, this introduction of ICS, industrial control system specific modular malware. And that's the first time we started using this phrase of, it's like a Swiss Army knife for an industrial control system where you're looking at what was delivered, but what was packaged and delivered in that tool set was based on the job they were going to work. So if you're an electrician coming into a home and you know you're changing an outlet, you may come in with a pair of wire strippers, a pair of lines, and some wire nuts and some other tools. If you're coming to wire an entire house, you'll come with benders and other things. And depending on the job you're trying to perform, you're bringing different tools. Think of the modular malware in a similar way. If they know what controllers are at a target, they're not going to bring all kinds of libraries and packages for controllers that aren't there. If they know the protocols that are there, they're going to pack it. And when we started seeing that with 2016, the concern immediately rose because you could assume there's a whole bunch of other capabilities that aren't included in this crash override malware. As we progress up and you look towards a safety instrumented system manipulation, that was something that came out before we were even really talking proof of concept in that space, and it was already being actively exploited, indicating kind of the progression that is being made by adversary groups, and really just waiting for a conflict to occur, which is where we're all living now and why we're starting to see, and we're going to see more in 2022 and 2023 as there is active conflict where critical infrastructure is in the crosshairs. This is a slide that I think is very important, and we've used it for years, kind of showing different campaigns, different activity groups, where are things progressing on the level of industrial control system customization and the level of industrial control system impacts. When something happens, the community often wants to see, well, where would you rank that? And as we look at this and say, well, there's a lot of things that could be discussed across what is underneath the X and Y axis or what is next to it. Did it include exploits? Did it include payload? What was the difficulty of delivery? And again, on the bottom, kind of how nuanced or what was the ultimate impact? We've done our best to sort of place things where they go, but with each one, it's a complicated discussion because we're trying to keep a common measure and not change the things on the sides. But where we take PIPEDREAM and say, it was customized to the level of what they needed for a mission. But the most important thing about it is it's customizable and it's completely changeable. New modules will appear over time. The ICS impact, we could talk about what the impact could have been based on the module capability, but this was not exploited in the wild. We can't go to a site and say, look at the harm they caused. We could say, look at what they could have done. Next. With that, we are going to go to, we're going to go to talk about those specific modules. Rob's going to kind of anchor here for a while, walking through what they have discovered and the different capabilities of it.
Fantastic. All right, so there's been plenty of questions. I gave my presentation at S4. I have some slides from that presentation for here. then I'll give kind of a more complete version of it at the SANS ICS Summit on day 2, I believe. But a lot of things to focus on, a lot of things to dig into. I'm going to try to be very precise with my words. Those of you that know me to quickly talk and so forth. I'm going to try to be real methodical because there's some real important points for you to take away. So the group behind PIPEDREAM is a team that we call Chernovite. We always just come up with random industrial minerals as names. We try to stay out of the attribution game. We don't really care. So as we look at Chernovite, the thing to be aware of is, number one, everybody keeps asking us, where do we find this? And I don't think that's all that relevant, to be candid, but to try to be honest to the community, in early 2022, so dating back to January, there was an undisclosed partner that said, hey, we found some, we work with them all the time to kind of look for things out in the community, out in the wild. They said, hey, we think we found something interesting. Do you guys want to take a look at it? And so we got involved, started to take a deep dive into it. Our malware versers and folks at Dragos were digging into it, and very quickly identified this as an ICS capable framework. And the important piece of information here is it was not employed in a target environment. It does not mean it wasn't deployed somewhere out in the world. We're not getting into where we found this, largely because we know the adversary is trying to hurt people, trying to hurt sites, trying to go after sites. Last thing I want them to know is how we're watching them. So we're being a little bit dodgy, but there's a purpose for it. So it wasn't employed at any of the target sites, but it was available somewhere out in the world. We were able to find it, get a little bit ahead of the adversary, which in my experience is the first time publicly we can talk about actually being a step ahead of an adversary, where we actually got to their capability before they were able to deploy it against their targets. The other piece that's really important here to understand is that PIPEDREAM was intended for disruptive and destructive effects, and that would have been outside of a shooting war kind of conflict scenario. What I'm trying to highlight there is there's a mental model of a lot of defenders of focusing on things you can't control. You get to control everything about what you do in your environment, how you configure it, the security procedures, the response plans, the culture, the investments you make. You get to own everything that the adversary has to live in your world. The one thing you don't get to own, and you don't even get a vote on, is if the adversary thinks you're a good target or not. And yet in policy circles and executive discussions and cybersecurity practitioner discussions, I always hear well, we're not a good target, or China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, whatever, they wouldn't do X. Well, you don't get a vote on that. So please stop focusing on it. And I think PIPEDREAM, you will see it change the policy circle's opinion very strongly. And the reason for that is PIPEDREAM was developed for the intention of being deployed against US infrastructure sites. And they were going, our assessment is they were going to deploy it, and we're not at war with anybody. And so you can talk about how different countries view us and supporting Ukraine and all sorts of other things, but we're not in a shooting war with anybody. And they were going to try to take down US infrastructure sites, and that is crazy to think about. So the other thing to highlight, and I'll show the capabilities, we'll get into this, for Chernovite's initial target set was US liquid natural gas and key electric power sites, from what we can see and what we know. We have a good level of visibility here. And what I mean by initial is we'll talk about the modules, and people are focusing on things like Schneider Electric and Omron. And that is missing the whole point of this capability. The initial configuration was with a very specific set of Schneider Electric and Omron devices configured in a very specific way for the targets they were going to go after. It's not just future modules. The existing capabilities in PIPEDREAM are in no way confined to Schneider Electric and Omron devices. There's not vulnerabilities in the Schneider Electric and Omron devices that the adversary is taking advantage of. It has nothing to do with the specific equipment. So what we're saying is the configuration of PIPEDREAM was towards that equipment, but not the capabilities of PIPEDREAM. Okay, not just future development, but not even existing. So in my assessment out to asset owners and operators that I work with, my comments to them is, if you're in US electric or liquid natural gas, and I would extend that to allied countries as well, just in case we don't have the right visibility. But I would say if you're in those two sectors and you have Schneider Electric and Omron devices, the ones that we talk about, you should assume you're compromised and go hunting. And I'm not saying you're compromised. We think we've caught this completely ahead of where the adversary was going. But that doesn't mean they're going to stop just because they got caught. If you have that specific configuration and you're in those sectors and sites, I'd be hunting, proactively going in your environment. If you're not using Schneider Electric and Omron devices, or you're not in those sectors, it's not a reason to go, yeah, we're done. That's where you should say, great, I've got time. Let me look at my response plans and make sure that the security controls that I'm putting in place are actually making sense against a real world scenario that I'm likely to have to deal with in the future, whether it's this specific team or another one copying the tradecraft and TTPs that they've shown. So when we get into PIPEDREAM, the way to think about PIPEDREAM is it's really a collection of tools. Okay, so it's not just one malware, it's a framework of tools. And I'm going to quickly walk through a couple of these. I just want to leave as much time as possible for questions at the end. But the first capability in PIPEDREAM is something we call lazy cargo. So that's the malware. And it does exploit a vulnerability. It's a known vulnerability back from 2020. But it does not need to. So I'm always looking for where a defender is going to give themselves an out. Oh, I don't have that vulnerability. I'm good. I can move on. No. Yes, it is exploiting that vulnerability for ASRock drivers, but it does not need any vulnerabilities to load the unsigned driver on any Windows system. It works against all motherboard manufacturers. So there are people going, do I have ASRock? Do I have that vulnerability? No, I'm good. You should be saying, do I have ASRock and that vulnerability? I might be the target. If I don't have those two things, I still have this issue because this works against all motherboard manufacturers and there's no exploits required. You should think of this as the capability for them to get think of it as persistence on a system, largely Windows systems. The next thing they would be able to use is a capability called Dust Tunnel. And this one is what they would use for command and control and actually getting exfiltration or data collection in and out of that environment. This is a Windows implant, again, works on all the different Windows environments, does not need an exploit to get onto the system. Once they already have access to environments, they can start deploying these capabilities. And they're using native functionality on Windows systems for file registry enumeration, for getting hardware and operating system information, for figuring out the level of security on the system, all the classic anti-forensics like VM detection and anti-debugging capabilities you'd expect. But the thing to focus on is this is the capability for the exfiltration and downloading of new files and uploading new files back and forth between the target and the adversary. The next capability is where it starts to get ICS specific. And this is where we get to that stage 2 of the ICS kill chain. It's an ICS specific capability. And this one does have focus, in my opinion, that is much wider than the target set. When you look at the ability to leverage OPC and the way that they're doing it, there's a lot of different industrial protocols out there. I mean, there's 150 plus unique ICS protocols. But when you're looking at Modbus TCP, OPC, a couple of different types of like ICCP in the electric sector, DMP3, there's a couple really common protocols. The two that cut across to everyone is OPC and Modbus TCP. So for an adversary to take advantage of OPC in such a way that is not only useful for developing knowledge and enumerating the environment, but also actually executing an attack and using OPC to write values that you need in that attack, that is a strong capability in itself. How strong a capability? All of NDestroyer 2 is basically just doing what Mousehole is doing. The OPC module in Crash Override / NDestroyer, whichever name you want to call it, the Crash Override in 2016 cyber attack was a worse version of this capability. This is a very clear indication that the adversaries are learning from each other. It's not that it's the same group. We don't know. Probably not, though. But it is. They are absolutely reading the public documentation, understanding how these attacks are working, and learning. The OPC module in PIPEDREAM is a better, much better version than what we saw in Crash Override. So they're learning and adapting quickly. Okay. So an OPC focused capability. The next one, Bad Omen, is a capability leverage that uses and interacts with Omron devices. Now, the other thing to be aware of here is it does not need to be Omron specific. So the capabilities it has in terms of grabbing data off the network, being able to upload and download files, being able to cause communications issues on a controller, being disruptive, it's not Omron specific. It just happens to also have configurations for the Omron APIs and the Omron FINS protocol that Omron uses. So it's super well tailored to Omron equipment. It's in no way bound to Omron equipment, but you have the ability to also go and tamper with controller memory and start interacting with the logic itself. Now, one of the more clever components of this capability is the ability to relay EtherCAT commands down to the actual physical equipment. So think like servo drives and things like that. So an ability not just to modify the PLC and its logic, but to speak through the PLC to the physical equipment. That's where you can tell that they can have a physical disruption, physical potentially destruction type effect. The next capability, which is really the one I think was really worth focusing on, is Evil Scholar. It is configured and highly specific to Schneider Electric. It is in no way specific to Schneider Electric across its capability. Same theme throughout the presentation, right? So this capability can use Schneider Electric's like Net Manager and its configurations to enumerate the network. But the actual thing it's taking advantage of is the Codesys library. And that Codesys library is not just used in Schneider Electric. Actually, it's probably one of the, if not the most common library in PLCs across the world. So there are hundreds of different controllers across the world, if not more. There are dozens of OEMs that leverage this exact Codesys framework. And that is what is being leveraged. And as I mentioned earlier, OPC and Modbus TCP are the worst ones, right? In terms of being able to go after lots of industry. This capability can use Modbus. So I joked with Tim about this earlier, which is all a very serious conversation, but I joked about it anyways, where I said, look, when we were always talking over the years about what could come next, one of the things that I would say is like, man, if you're using OPC or Modbus TCP, or hell, if you're going after something like Codesys, man, that'd be bad. This framework has all three. So it's literally the things we thought would be the worst things to manifest. They're all coming together. So I don't want to downplay how significant this capability is with its ability to not only cause disruption in the environment by manipulating logic and controllers, but by the ability to go cross industry, cross world, in terms across global environment, in terms of actually being able to do its capabilities. And we know the adversary was also configuring on the Schneider Electric controllers that were used in safety systems. So this capability is not only disruptive in nature, also can be used for destruction, but it can be used to target safety environments and cause safety impacts as well. So it's a completely good framework to use. Now, one of the things I really want to highlight here with this capability specifically, though, is the PLC proxying. And I'm going to describe it and then tell you why it's so important. So what the adversary is able to do is once they get on the engineer workstation, they're able to use the capabilities in PIPEDREAM to manipulate one of the PLCs that it's connected up to. Again, it doesn't matter if it's Schneider or Omron. It's about using Codesys. So they know how to interact with that PLC. But then they're able to use that PLC as a proxy to hit other PLCs or other equipment in that environment. Why does that matter so much? Because in industrial security, 95% plus of all the efforts we traditionally do are preventative in nature. And it usually comes around segmentation, access management, passwords, patching, but a lot of focus on segmentation. Like 62443, you're going to have a whole focus on zones and conduits. People are going to talk about Purdue model and other environments. NERC is going to talk about the ESPs and configuring those environments. But what it generally relates to is we have an environment that's very crunchy to get into, difficult to get into. But once you're inside, it's pretty soft and gooey. But if you're doing all the zones and conduits, you will have north and south communications between level 3 and level 2 and level 1. But then you might try to restrict the ability to go anywhere other than that. So you might be telling yourself, yeah, but I can only hit that one controller, or that one historian, or that one device. Don't worry about it. You can't hit anything else on the network. Well, with Evil Scholar, yes, you can. So that over focus on segmentation and zones and conduits, it's not a bad thing to have, but it is almost irrelevant in this capability. This is where if you're not doing east-west monitoring, if you're not getting data out of those environments and you're just watching what comes in and out of a firewall, you are missing every opportunity to detect and respond to these types of capabilities. So when we put it all together, here's what to think about, here's what to expect. So number one, Chernovite is the effects team. They're not the access team. So I get questions all the time of, well, how would this get into the environment? It doesn't matter. They're not the access team. So every state actor has malware development teams, exploit teams, infrastructure teams, research and analysis teams, effects teams, access teams. They're not one big adversary. You've got different teams that have different focuses. So Trinovite can ride on top of essentially whoever gets access in your environment. So all the different groups that you're already tracking, all the different groups you're already thinking about, all the different methods to get into industrial environments, VPNs, in and out of the environments, et cetera. All those things are valid. All the work you're putting there is wonderful. If you're not putting work there, you're way behind, but you should be putting work there. If you're putting work there, good job. That's access. There's no preventing Trinovite. And I'm not trying to be anti-defender here. Defenders have the upper hand. Defense is doable here. However, there is no preventing Trinovite because Trinovite is not the team that breaks down the door. You're preventing somebody else. Once any of them have access, they can hand off their access to Trinovite. So you're not preventing them. You should be focusing on how to detect and respond to this capability and to this group. But you would expect to see dust tunnel and mouse hole in kind of those IT environments. You'd expect to see lazy cargo anywhere, but you'd expect to see evil scholar and bad omen down in the actual control networks. They do not have to use all these capabilities. Any one of them is a perfectly fine capability. Between bad omen and evil scholar and mouse hole, you could use either of those three to cause disruptive and destructive effects. So we don't think that the adversary would necessarily use all modules all at once, but they could. But these are the ones you have to think about. And we're going to pivot now to talk about risk and then mitigations. But I know someone's going to ask, what are the indicators? And I cannot share them anyways because of some of the sensitivities of the operation and the security work we're doing. But it actually doesn't matter. And I know that's going to infuriate somebody. But this is a capability we found before it was employed against its target. There's not the normal indicators. There's not going to be command and control addresses and things like that. And as it relates to the capabilities themselves, based on the configurations, the hashes and every other aspect are going to rapidly change. With the combinations they use rapidly change. The focus on the indicators is massively misplaced. The focus should be on the tactics, techniques, and procedures like you'd find at a MITRE attack for ICS. PIPEDREAM ends up using something north of 30% of all the TTPs that you'd find in MITRE attack for ICS. And looking at how you'd be able to find if a PLC was communicating and making changes to another PLC, as an example. So all the things that we've been talking about over the years, network monitoring and access management, like all the different ways we've been putting security controls in front of you, they all apply. If you've been listening to the advice for the last 6-7 years, you're in a good place. Like this doesn't change anything different. Like, yeah, you got to tailor your response plan and all, but like you put good controls in place. If you haven't been doing those things, you are way behind at this point in time and need to hurry it up. So Tim, back over to you.
Yes, sir. So I think some of the most important stuff to really dive into is the unique opportunity we have here to look at something pre-exploit, look at what that team decided to pull in from a capability, from a package perspective, and start thinking about what types of targets that may have represented. And very similar to when we saw the last ICS modular malware, which was the 2016 crash override, we need to learn from that and avoid the same mistakes. So looking at crash override from 2016, kind of looking at this slide and looking at those risks and saying, well, hey, if I was in Europe and I saw crash override and I saw that it was using IEC 101 and it was using IEC 104 and 61850 and OPC for control, and I would say, I'm using all those protocols, so it's of a concern to me. And then I would look to say it also had an exploit capability within that pack, and it was targeting Siemens Ciprotec relays. And then am I in that sector? Am I in critical infrastructure that is using that type of product? And how am I using it from a protective relay perspective? Likely bulk power transmission. Am I specifically using a Siemens Ciprotec? And you would continue to work your way through these discussion items of the capability of that modular malware. And many outside of Europe, so coming over to North America and looking at this and saying, we don't use IEC 101, we don't use IEC 104, we're not using 61850 in a way that would be manipulated, nor OPC UA within power transmission. Next, we're not using Siemens Ciprotec, so no concerns here. If you go to the next slide. Ultimately, one of the things we learned from Crash Override and kind of the 2016 event is that conversation along the lines of, if you see a piece of modular malware, you shouldn't simply be looking at its unique current capabilities, but rather how quickly it can be modified, and assume that the things that matter to you are already there. They just weren't delivered in that compiled piece of malware that you were doing analysis on. So if you currently looked at Crash Override 2016 and said, we don't use those protocols, we don't use those products, it's not a concern to us, we're currently low risk, and off you went. But staying connected into the community and coming to events like this and getting kind of situational awareness data feeds and cyber threat intel and doing the hunting to make sure it's not in your environment already. And how quickly could you pivot to, wait, so they discovered a new version that is going after a different vendor protection relay. And it's what we're using all over the place. They're using DNP3 instead of IEC 101 and 104. There's another module indicating they're working on ICCP communications to move from control center to control center. And then how quickly could you move from a we don't care low risk to a extreme high risk, and then thinking about what could you do about it? How fast could you act if you needed to go out and make a change and do something to edge devices throughout a service territory across multi-state at multiple control centers, manipulating different types of ICCP data point exchange? It's a very hard problem to action if you're looking to do it at the endpoints and thinking about where you could action it on communication paths and normal operating procedures instead. Thinking now about how fast can you move, and is that the same rate that the adversary group can repackage different tools, repackage different exploits, and release PIPEDREAM 2, PIPEDREAM 3, PIPEDREAM 4, multiple variants. As those things start to include components and elements that matter to your operating environment, how fast can you pivot, and can you pivot at the same rate as the adversary group? Next.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, again, not to beat the dead horse here, but Tim and I are already starting to see people go, oh, I don't have Schneider, I don't have Omron, I'm good. And I'm sorry, but that's highly inappropriate at this point in time in the community. So let's get into our next section where we're going to really focus on mitigations. And then I've already been answering some questions, but if you can keep lining up questions in the Q&A button, we'll have plenty of time to go through them today.
The only reason I wanted to show this slide, we almost pulled it, was we have been doing a series on kind of the Russia-Ukraine war across sands and talking and kind of delivering messages of what people should be considering and thinking about, obviously, if they're in Ukraine and what that means to them. The ongoing coordinated cyber physical attacks and doing and targeting critical infrastructure in ways that enable the invasion and entrenchment. I think that message has not changed from the day we first started talking about this. In a similar way, we've been talking about there's this tit for tat kind of back and forth that'll happen where if sanctions are coming and impacting SWIFT and impacting financial environments, expect attacks to come over against financial environments. If there are commitments and support from allied nations to assist if natural gas was impacted, and we're going to be assisting through LNG, assume port facility, terminal facility, maritime are going to be impacted. As you started to see the shift in how Ukraine was operating the critical infrastructure and electric system, and the significant move to operate in ways they've never operated before over into the NetSOE system, assume organizations involved in helping that are going to become on the target list. And as you begin to kind of dive into, well, how would they target it? Again, Rob mentioned we're not in many countries are not part of the bullets and missiles flying, but so assume other countries, other nations, the right hand of this slide, this adversary looking to position, validate capabilities, have the ability to pursue effects-based attacks, and ultimately kind of targeting outages is one thing, but causing equipment damage or manipulating the system and what they would need to do to achieve that with a tool set similar to what we saw in 2016, that is what we're talking about here, looking at PIPEDREAM, that this is that toolbox. This is a demonstration of all of those things we've been saying on the right that other countries should be worried about. Currently, it's Schneider and Omron. Currently, it's involving Codesys. Currently, it's expanding from OPC to a number of things that you could hit from a protocol perspective. But that's because that's what that package was for the targets that were being considered for that package. There should be an assumption and an expectation that the things you care about are in other packages, and they will be discovered when the exploit happens. When the attack happens, we have the unique opportunity to look at it now before it happened and start considering this is a demonstration of what else they have and what other capabilities exist. And we need to start thinking creatively around what the next ones might look like. How would we detect it? How would we defend against it?
Perfect. And with that, let's get into the mitigations and the things we want you to do. And you're going to see these in a lot of our presentations. These 5 specifically is one of the reasons Tim is here with me this week. Is we've kind of been blessed to go through different phases at SANS ICS based on community interaction, where y'all are in your journey and kind of pushing to the next level. And we just went through kind of the last phase, which was updating all of the SANS ICS courses to have much more physical equipment hands-on, the new 612 course, the new manager course. Like there's kind of that phase of cool, now let's level up one. Like when I first developed ICS 515 and launched it back in 2014, a while 15. Ago. 14, it was GridSec, yeah. And then 15 at the ICS Summit. But when I developed that class, I did it based on where the community was and a little bit more where I wanted to go. This past iteration and the big upgrade of it, moving into a 6-day class, was where we are and where I wanted to go next. This is that next phase, if you will, the Marvel universe, kind of the next phase is Tim and I and the other instructors and authors at the SANS ICS side of the house are really going to be pushing these 5 controls and showing you how they work together to get into that phase that we've been talking about before around active defense and being able to use the best of environments. And we'll capture this in a number of critical ways to come out and to follow. But let me talk about these 5 controls and how they work together and why I think you should be using PIPEDREAM and Chernovite as the model to leverage. So in other words, if you are, take a step back, if you are a power company and you haven't prepared for the hypothetical scenario of Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea teaming up to be a superpower and come after you with all the latest research that got published at Black Hat and DEF CON, I would look at you and go, good, the ratepayers shouldn't be paying for those hypotheticals, that your shareholders should not be paying for those hypotheticals. It's a business risk assessment, and the business risk of these hypotheticals and the unknowns, super low. But if you're a power company and you haven't prepared for the 2015 Ukraine attack, the 2016 Ukraine attack, and now PIPEDREAM and ransomware across your operations, like those 4 scenarios, you should be legally liable to your community. Like you were way behind. And that sounds harsh, but it's accurate. And all the ratepayers and everybody else out there have already said, go forth and conquer. So using power as an example, right? But if you're in manufacturing, you haven't done ransomware across manufacturing lines, you're behind and you're going to have issues for your shareholders. So what I think about is ground truth reality, the knowns. I don't want you to prepare for every unknown. There's no way to do that. I don't want you to protect every piece of equipment in your company. There's no way to do that. But taking a risk-based approach to understand what your crown jewels are and taking a scenario-driven approach, an intel-driven approach on what has actually happened, and let's look at that scenario, that's the right way to do it. So the way that I would use these 5 controls, or actually one more tangent, and I'll tell you, the other problem I have is people usually start with, let me get a good architecture in place. Then I want to think about vulnerability management. Then I want to think about access control. Then I want to think about visibility. Then I want to think about a response plan. Then I want to think about whatever. And the problem is it never becomes aligned. When it gets to the incident response, you find out you didn't have the data you thought you did. You didn't have the configuration of the environment you thought you did. You didn't have the detection strategy to even detect the threats you wanted to detect to get to the response. And it's also misaligned that you invest a lot of money and time and resources, but you're not getting the cohesion out of it. So in my view, I would do these 5 and I would do it in this order. And you can move quickly, but I would still do it in this order. I'd start off with an OT or ICS specific incident response plan, bringing people in that know ICS in your company, bringing IT and OT together. I would figure out a couple scenarios that you should deal with. My big pitch here is I would use PIPEDREAM. PipeDream covers so many of the tactics and techniques and capabilities that we've seen over the year that if you modeled your program off nothing other than PipeDream, you'd be in a great place. Shoot PipeDream in ransomware, but you could get away with missing the Ukraine events of 2015 and 2016 and be in a great place with building out a scenario against PipeDream. Do it all if you can. Start with PipeDream. So start with that scenario. And the reason I like scenarios is it is very aligned with like process hazard analysis and HAZOP, so your safety communities and operations and engineering, but also board members and executives can deal with scenarios. They're technical. They're not jargon focused, but they are technical. GAAP revenue accounting is technical. They're fine, okay? It's your choice of jargon that gets confusing at the board meeting. So at the board meeting, it is a binary discussion. Do we as a company want to be prepared for this scenario? It's not a nickel and diming on cost. It's not a nickel and diming on controls. It's not the level of a board. A board is there for scenario planning and risk mitigation and benchmarking against other companies. That's what they do. So is this a scenario the company should be responding to or be able to deal with? Yes or no? I would say yes in this case. Great. Then it should go to the security team to build out a tabletop exercise, use outside partners if you want, bring in the operations people and go, hey, if we wanted to deal with this type of scenario, how might this manifest in our environment? What type of assets do we have that would even be in scope? And what are the requirements we're going to need from regulatory, from legal, from shareholders, from financial, from litigation, from incident response, from network security, from root cause analysis, just for the operations people to get the plant back up and going? What are all the questions that are going to need to be answered? And perfect incident response, what does that perfect incident response look like of all the questions we're answering? Then take all those questions and assets, and you're figuring out your crown jewels across your environment. And now you're figuring out, what do I need my architecture to be able to do for me? Which gets us to the second control. That's where you can figure out what is your collection management framework need to be, all right? Your CMF, there's a nice white paper out there that I wrote, collection management framework. So what is my collection management framework do I need? What data am I going to need to support those questions? Where do I have it? How is it stored? Where should it be stored? What basic risks do I want the architecture to mitigate for me? I don't want to deal with Bitcoin mining on an HMI. How do I just not make that a thing so I can focus on the scenarios I want? Do I need span ports in a substation, so I can actually get the visibility and access that I want? It's not just north and south, but east and west. So what do I need my architecture to do for me? The next thing I'm putting in place is that OT network monitoring. In IT security, we deal a lot with system security and data security. In ICS security, it's systems of systems and physics. So I don't really care so much about host-based logging if I don't have network data. Sure, host-based logging is okay, and I want it eventually. But let's start with network data, because I want to see system-to-system level comms. I want to see a PLC is using a FINS protocol to modify another PLC. That system one impacts system two with a physical manifestation in system three and ICS protocol inspection. That's what I need for this. So how do I get the network monitoring, which is also going to enhance my defensible architecture so it doesn't atrophy over time? The any rule in the firewall, the new connection that got stood up. How do I maintain that architecture is good? And how do I identify where all my connections in and out of my environment are to support the fourth control? Then it's a classic IT control, but I need to make sure that I am figuring out where remote access is, getting to a defensible architecture with choke points and similar, and wherever I can, deploying multi-factor authentication on those remote sessions out to vendors, integrators, OEMs, et cetera. And where I can't, going back and putting compensating controls in my defensible architecture. And then another element of that OT network monitoring, by the way, is I can have use cases now to the SOC on what takes us to the incident. Not detect every anomaly and flood yourselves, but what are the behaviors, what are the aspects that I need to monitor for that could trigger the incident response in the scenarios that we care about? So I'm guiding and aligning top to bottom in the organization. And then lastly, we get to a risk-based vulnerability management. There's so many folks that come into an operations environment and go, oh my God, it's vulnerable, I got to patch things. Stop it. There's a lot of system focus you're bringing that's not relevant to the OT risk that we're talking about. So instead, what are the vulnerabilities that add functionality into the environment or do something new that's not already resident? Oh, well, this vulnerability allows a privilege escalation on a flow meter so you can get to root. Well, great, I don't really care about the flow meter that much. However, more importantly, the engineer workstation can already access it directly in root privileges. That vulnerability doesn't do anything for me. Who cares? It doesn't do any new risk. Don't worry about it. So when we look at, and this isn't our year in review reports, but when we look at the vulnerabilities, we find that about 4% really matter. 4%. And that would be something like, say you have a vulnerability in a data historian bridging your IT and OT environment, and it's a remote code execution vulnerability where I can leverage it to get access to the ICS. That's really important. You should go fix that. Or what if it's a vulnerability that allows modification of logic on a engineer workstation and a controller without leaving any forensic capabilities behind? Yeah, that'd be a big one to go focus on. But if it's not something at that level, if it's not that 4%, stop wasting your time and effort. And if I have the IT incident response in the scenario guiding all the rest of it, you much more easily be able to figure out what that risk-based approach to vulnerability management is anyways. So don't start up and go the other way. Don't pick the 20 critical controls out there. Don't go peanut butter spread things. Get these 5 right, and you will have a world-class OT security program. Tim, anything to add on there?
Yep. Just thinking about this, if you're an asset owner and you're attending this and you're thinking, great, so you've helped where SANS went, or CIS went from 20 critical controls to 18, and now you're highlighting kind of 5 for ICS OT people to go pursue. And as you think about these 5 things in the scope of kind of what we've talked about on this webcast, so just grabbing some of those scenarios for your OT specific incident response and saying, what if the tooling from crash override, the ability to operate a system in a damaging way without protection in place existed, and some part of our electric system or some part of our operation was impacted, and that was followed by, we're going to move into now in the scenario how we're doing recovery and how we're continuing to operate, how are we going to manage our facility or our site. And then you start to look at PIPEDREAM and you say, what if PIPEDREAM was used to manipulate our backup power and our essential service panels? What if those things were no longer available? And now truly the types of capabilities that we need, and now we want to do recovery. What if they use the same types of capabilities they demonstrated in 2015, where the firmware of some of these devices was destroyed, some of the communication paths that we need to talk out, and you can begin to take and build an OT incident response scenario that aligns with a couple of lessons learned events that happened in the real world, now including PIPEDREAM. That is a capability. It wasn't necessarily a lesson learned of look what damage was caused. It's a capability that's been discovered that can now allow you to think about, what does that mean for you and for your organization? And to broaden it a little to not just be certain controllers, certain vendors, but apply it to what you care about in certain systems. And ensuring that your response plan isn't just an IT IR plan off the shelf that is specific to your operational goals of what you're trying to achieve and how you conduct your business, and who you would be sharing information with and talking to along the way, who you would be calling for help on the vendor side and on the response team side. Prioritize those events to the sites and the assets that matter the most, and begin to look at kind of those defensible architectures that exist in those spaces. Also looking at PIPEDREAM from the perspective of not only how can you prepare for an event, but looking at it and saying, if you were doing these 5 things, how do these 5 things apply to PIPEDREAM? Certainly from a IR perspective and from an architecture perspective, it applies to all of the modules that have been identified. And those 2 things will apply to, in general, most of the modules that come in the future. But if you look specifically kind of towards the evil scholar or the bad omen or mouse hole specifically, you can begin to look across and say, if we didn't have network monitoring, how much of this picture would we miss if we were simply waiting for an IOC to come to go hunt? And that IOC is going to be varied by target, and it's going to be maybe prolific for a period of time, but change rapidly. And if that's what we're relying on, even if we have OT network monitoring, is it going to help? And again, beginning to look at your defenses, your tools, your technology, your people, your processes, how you're training folks, and also measuring that against current malware and saying, will this be effective? If we actually deploy and implement the way we're planning, or should we pivot based on what we've learned from an adversary group? They're learning from themselves. We should learn from them as well. And we should absolutely be learning from each other. So as different sectors and different industries experience events, coming together in forums like this is really, really important for all of us. I don't know how many
Absolutely.
questions we have, but I think it would be good if we save 10 minutes for whatever's out there.
Yep. So that's the end of the presentation. So let's get into the questions. And so we have already quite a few coming in. So the first one is, I assume a majority of the communications on ICS networks are unencrypted. Am I correct in assuming that? You are correct. We don't use a lot of encryption inside ICS networks. However, I'm very glad about that. Encrypting the ICS communications provides absolutely no risk reduction against any of the types of things we're talking about. You could use encryption, but not network protocol encryption. So as an example, if I was able to do digital signing of firmware before it got moved to a controller, or validation of an IEC4 master spinning up before it was able to communicate, those would be wonderful things. So like that, like authentication and level encryption, wonderful. Encryption of the actual communications internal to networks, irrelevant. And now it's hurting your ability to monitor, but not actually doing anything against the adversary.
I'll say that is something that comes up all the time with efforts to go pursue. Some of those may actually have a valid purpose depending on a environment. But generally speaking, we have fought for decades as an industry to get the visibility we finally have, and then to have companies come forward that can enable us to do something with all that information. Moving towards an encryption is really, really going to take you steps back. In addition, it's adding attack vectors.
Yep.
So if that infrastructure needs to exist for process communications to occur, attacking that infrastructure could make it so your process environment can no longer communicate.
Perfect. With the ongoing needs in Europe for fuels due to the war, and as the liquid gas industry is being seen as a target, has there been any indications of these tools and adversaries using satellite or space communications and protocols and similar to hide their targeting or otherwise do targeting? And the answer is yes. So hiding their targeting through satellite-based communications, not so much, not that I've seen. Using satellite-based communications, going after VSAT terminals, going after VSAT providers, using those as access paths and using them as disruption paths. Yes, we've seen quite a bit of that. The VSAT compromise is something to pay attention to, happened in the earlier days of the Ukraine conflict. And it was very impactful across like all the German renewables and wind farms as an example. Tim?
You'll see them get targeted if they're part of the operational owners' normal cause of communication. So in a number of large multi-state pipeline, there's a whole big reliance on satellite communications and comms. So if the asset owner normally uses them for operations, then you will see a adversary group target them for delivery and manipulation.
What is the general availability of PIPEDREAM? I'd like to, is it something that's likely to be carefully controlled by Chernovite for their own purposes, or might it be made broadly available for other threat groups? So to our knowledge today, it is closely held by Chernovite. However, one of the hard and difficult things about ICS security is malware, exploits, vulnerabilities, et cetera, tend not to be the point because it's systems of systems, tends to be how do you do things? So like the focus on tactics, techniques, and procedures gets a lot of traction in the enterprise IT security community. It's almost the whole game in industrial security though. And so as an example, now that somebody has shown, here's how you do this, and here's how you interact with these protocols, and here's how you could absolutely take advantage of, PLC comms with code assist. Now that the information is out there around how to do these things, other adversaries can and will pick those up, just like we saw Chernovite learn about the OVC module from Crash Override. It's one of the reasons when Dragos and SANS publishes papers, we don't go into as much technical details as everybody would like us to. There's a lot of researchers out there like, show me the capability, show me the modules, show me the code snippets, show me how to do exactly this implementation of the IEC-104 protocol. And like, no, let's not show exactly how to do these things, but here's just the information you need for just defensive purposes. So there's a reason behind that. For the folks that struggle with the IT side, where should they start first on the OT side? The capacity is to do one thing in 2022. What should it be? So I'll give my answer. I'm sure Tim might have a different answer. The first thing I'll say is you should remind yourselves that you're usually in the business of producing services and goods that relates to your operations environment. So you're usually not in the business of running a website. And so I don't mean to be too flippant there, but when I see infrastructure companies that are spending way more time and effort on their enterprise than on their OT, you are misunderstanding your mission. But if that's your case, that's fine. What's the one thing you would do? To me, it depends on where you are. If you're in a situation where your executives or board or others don't really understand the need and you have a funding issue, I would start with the OT incident response plan. That's going to give you an understanding of how you would do against the types of scenarios you worry about. And you're going to be able to elevate those scenarios to show the risk that exists to the business and your level of preparedness against it. When we do incident response cases, it is one of the most common things between all cases is for the executives and the boards to have a rosier view of their security than is actually happening in reality. So that OT incident response plan with that tabletop exercise can raise the understanding at an executive level. If you have funding or at least support in the executive level, and your friction is between IT and OT, where it's cultural, it's just cultural, still OT incident response plan, tabletop exercise, bring them together. But if it relates to something specific, like OT doesn't see the value in your security efforts, or IT doesn't see the value in getting security insights out of the operations environments, then I would skip to number 3 and I would do the OT network monitoring, because that'll give you the visibility, which is just ground truth reality of what's actually happening in these environments. Showing the operations staff things like your OEMs and maintenance and contractor folks doing logic changes outside of scheduled maintenance periods, and all the connections and all the activity that they have that they may not have known is going to get their buy-in really quickly. Showing the security people the type of telemetry you can get them for being able to go and do monitoring in these environments in a non-invasive way off of something like passive span port, super useful to getting their buy-in. So culture or executive buy-in, control number 1. If you have buy-in and you're trying to sort of show the reality of the situation and go get one of the sides or the other to go do OT network monitoring. If you have no problems, everyone's aligned, you're going to go do these 5 things, then just do them in order.
There's no right answer. So the specifics of what's going to work and where is it going to work is going to be very, very company specific. We have a future ICS.
Yes, buddy.
It's actually raining inside.
I'm so glad it's raining inside. So the first thing to do is get a better lock on your door. Yeah. All right. You take him. Thank you. All right. Go ahead, Tim.
All right. So it's going to be very specific to a facility and where they're at in their culture and in their life cycle. But I think when you start with a kind of a point of, if we have $1 to spend on cyber, to Rob's point, thinking about,
and now there's a dog,
thinking about what your business is. And if you kind of just general broad brush say, IT is how we manage our business. It's how we manage our data, how we communicate with our customers, how we manage this business. And OT is why we are a business. And you're looking at constrained budgets, constrained time, understanding why you exist as an organization is really important. And a lot of times when it comes to cybersecurity discussions, OT groups don't have a voice, don't have a seat in the room. And it's really important to make sure that that's happening so that you can adequately prioritize. And likewise, when operations is having meetings and talking about investment and capital projects and the process environment, absolutely equally as important to have IT and cybersecurity involved in that conversation. So each place, if we went into any of those environments, we would put the dunce hat on and say, tell me about what you do here, tell me how it works, tell me your challenges. And as you begin to soak in that culture and understand how things are working and where they are organizationally, you can begin to discover what's going to make the most difference. But without question, if you're at a point of we can only do one thing, that one thing needs to be an OT incident response plan. I struggle to see how you couldn't also add doing remote access better, meaning you're doing remote access anyway. Just find ways to do it better. I would focus on those 2 things if that's all you could do, but the answer is going to be unique to every place.
Perfect. Has PIPEDREAM shown any latent capability to insert itself into a PLC so that it hides within normal files, such as how Stuxnet operated to obfuscate itself? Not really. So it is not doing, like, could you use PIPEDREAM to manipulate logic and do the exact same thing? Yes, full stop. Does it automatically do that itself or kind of have that latent capability? No. Stuxnet was more of a purpose built for that site. It's going to do these things and be able to operate damn near autonomously. It's configured to operate that way. PIPEDREAM should be looked at as that toolbox to go do a variety of things. So could you configure PIPEDREAM to do something like that? I'm sure you could, but that's not how it is configured today. It is more of the framework. Perfect. And then I think we have time for one more, which is, and why don't you take this one? Not specific to PIPEDREAM, but on the earlier slide, you talked a little bit about IEC 101 protocol, and it seems to show it as a high risk. My understanding is it's a relatively small attack surface, and it hasn't been used as a tunnel to deploy the malware. However, it was used in the attack in a very creative way. So not in PIPEDREAM, but in Ukraine.
Correct. Depending on where you're at in the world, IEC 101 and 104 are going to be of much higher risk from a perspective of this is how you conduct normal operations, and an adversary that is coming from a dispatch or a control center and capable of communicating out and sending commands using the protocols you're using would be of higher risk if it was packaged within that piece of malware. If that same piece of malware was delivered to an entity that is not using those protocols, is not communicating out to field devices in that way, then it's going to show up as a lower risk to them. The key point was highlighting that the fact that those protocols were selected, the device exploits were selected in 2016 and in PIPEDREAM means they were selected based on the target. So begin to expand imagination to consider that the things I care about in my operations, they likely have those same protocol libraries and likely have similar exploits towards vulnerabilities of products that I care about. So start assessing your risk to move quickly to respond, assuming the next thing is discovered in its protocols and devices that you care about.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that, thanks everybody for joining us. Please join us at the SANS ICS Summit. We'll be going into much more of these conversations and much more depth, but appreciate you all keeping lights, water, power, manufacturing goods, oil and gas going. I generally like living in modern day society, so appreciate all the work y'all are doing. All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.